I never thought the first time I'd taste blood would be on the marble floor of my own family's foyer, dragged by my hair by the man who used to read me bedtime stories. That was the moment everything snapped. My name is Natalie Bennett. I'm 38, and I used to believe loyalty was earned through silence. But when my parents tossed me onto the front steps of the Bennett estate like trash, my suitcase cracked open, rain soaking everything I owned, I realized something chilling. They never saw me as family, only as a threat. For the first time in my life, I didn't cry. I planned, because behind their socialite smiles and silk-lined lies, they didn't know I held the one thing they couldn't buy, my grandfather's trust, and a secret he made sure they would never see coming. But how do you fight back when your enemies share your last name? Growing up in Charleston's prestigious South of Broad neighborhood, I had the kind of life people envy from afar, sailing lessons before I could drive, debutante balls I never wanted, private schools with perfectly ironed uniforms. But beneath all that polished charm, the Bennett house was a cathedral of favoritism and cold wars. My older sister, Meredith, was the heir apparent, the one with the flawless smile and the trust fund lined in pearls. I was the afterthought, the quiet one, the one who always got her report card signed last. But my grandfather, Robert Bennett, saw me, taught me to read market trends before I could legally drink, let me sit in on company meetings when I was still in braces. He said I had a mind for legacy, a soul for stewardship. And when he got sick, he didn't leave his empire to the daughter who had always smiled for cameras. He left it to me. I didn't ask for the war that followed. But once the will was read, and the room went quiet with rage, I knew they would never let me keep what he gave me. Not without a fight. Not without trying to break me. And they nearly did. But buried in the lining of an old pocket watch was a truth they forgot to bury. A plan Robert crafted for the day they turned on me. So if you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to love you most, or silenced for being too smart, too prepared, too inconvenient, this story is for you. Because what they stole, I took back. And I made sure they'd never forget who they underestimated. They called it a reading of the will, but it felt more like an ambush in pearls. The mahogany-paneled library was packed with thin smiles and thicker tension. Every eye in the room turned toward me like I'd stolen something, not inherited it. Meredith sat beside our mother in a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my first car, dabbing at her eyes as if she'd just lost a best friend. Truth was, she barely visited grandfather once in his final months. I, on the other hand, had spoon-fed him soup, adjusted his oxygen tank, and held his trembling hand as he whispered, "Watch the lie, so when Gregory Phillip." My mother's teacup shattered against the floor. My father muttered something about contesting the decision. Meredith let out a sob that curdled into a scoff. No one congratulated me. No one looked surprised. They already knew. And from that moment on, the house I grew up in, our sprawling estate on Colonial Street, turned cold. Doors that were once open slammed shut when I passed. The chef, who used to sneak me extra lemon bars, stopped speaking to me altogether. Meredith, once passively cruel, was now overtly venomous. "Enjoy it while it lasts," she said one night, leaning. I wanted to believe I was safe, that the law would protect my grandfather's wishes, that merit still mattered. But deep down, I knew the Bennetts didn't lose gracefully. I started finding things missing: files, legal documents, financial ledgers. When I asked Gregory for clarification, he gave me practiced reassurances with the smile of a man hiding a knife behind his back. And the worst part? No one in that house looked me in the eye anymore. Like I was already gone. Something was coming. I could feel it in the way Meredith hummed while arranging flowers outside grandfather's study. In the way my mother suddenly insisted I see a psychiatrist. They weren't just grieving. They were plotting. And I had no idea just how far they'd go, until the morning they decided to erase me. It started with the locks. One morning, I returned from the attorney's office to find the code on the side entrance changed. I stood there, bags in my hand, pressing the same digits I'd used since college, but the keypad blinked red again and again. When I asked Meredith about it, She shrugged from behind her oversized sunglasses and said, "Security update. You should really check your emails more often." Except I had checked them. There was nothing. No heads up. No reason. Just another quiet tactic in the campaign to shove me out of my own inheritance. After that, the staff who had once greeted me with warm smiles started averting their eyes. The house began swallowing my things, ledgers from grandfather's office, USB drives. Even my spare laptop vanished without explanation. When I confronted my father, he looked over his newspaper and said, "You're being paranoid, Natalie. Stress makes people imagine all sorts of things." They were trying to gaslight me, slowly, deliberately, and with terrifying precision. And the worst part? It was working. I started second-guessing myself. Did I really leave the ledger in the drawer? Had I just forgotten the combination to the safe? Was I spiraling like they wanted me to believe? Meredith leaned in harder, whispering to our mother behind closed doors, parading around the estate like it already belonged to her. She even began hosting planning dinners in the sunroom with Gregory Phillips, like she was the one grooming to take the helm. And when I told her to stop, she smiled that thin, sharp smile of hers and said, "You may hold the deed, Natalie, but we still hold the house." Then came the breaking point. The day I walked into grandfather's study and found the drawers empty, the shelves stripped, and the safe cracked wide open. Everything that proved my preparedness. My right to lead, my place in this family, gone. I fell to my knees on the hardwood floor, gripping the edge of the empty cabinet as a wave of helplessness crashed over me. That night, I texted my attorney and said, "Something is wrong. Very wrong." He replied with a single sentence, "Meet me first thing. Don't speak to anyone in the house." But I didn't make it to that meeting. Because by morning, they would drag me out, not with words, but with fists. And I would learn that losing your legacy doesn't always start with a courtroom. Sometimes it begins with silence and ends with violence. It happened at 6:17 a.m. I remember the time because I'd just made coffee and the sky outside was still lavender with dawn. I heard the footsteps first, heavy, hurried, and then the door to my room burst open. My father stood there, not in a suit like usual, but in jeans and a fleece pullover, like he was taking out the trash. "It's time to go," he said, voice flat. Behind him, Meredith appeared with two house staff members, men I had known for years, but now wouldn't meet my eyes. "You've overstayed," she added, smug and unbothered, like she was asking me to move off a park bench instead of out of my childhood home. I barely had time to grab my wallet before my father reached down, grabbed my wrist, and yanked me up with more force than I thought he was capable of. My shoulder cracked. I cried out. No one blinked. They dragged me, physically, down the front hallway, past the staircase where grandfather used to read me stories on rainy nights, past the fireplace where I'd sat with him last Christmas while he whispered, "They'll never understand the kind of woman you are, Natalie." But I do. The front door slammed behind me like a gavel. My suitcase was already waiting, sitting upright on the porch like a tombstone. I stood barefoot on the wet brick, still wearing the silk pajama pants grandfather had gifted me the year he died, as the Bennett estate loomed behind me like a castle that had declared me its ghost. For a full minute, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just stared at the brass lion knocker on the door and thought, this is how dynasties kill their own. I wanted to scream, to bang on the door, to demand answers, but something colder than rage settled in my chest. They wanted me broken. Instead, I turned and walked down the front path barefoot, heels clicking softly against stone. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the driveway that I realized I had nowhere to go. My phone buzzed. "Mallory." I answered with a whisper. They did it. She didn't even ask what I meant. "Come here," she said. "Now." But as I sat on the bus bench outside the estate's iron gates, I remembered something else, something I hadn't thought about in years. Grandfather's pocket watch. And the day he told me, "This isn't just to tell time, Natalie. It's to tell the truth, when no one else will." I hadn't opened the pocket watch in years. Not since the night grandfather gave it to me with shaking hands and a strange look in his eyes, like He was handing me a secret instead of a keepsake. I remember him saying, "Only open it when you feel like everything's been taken." And sitting there on that cold bus bench outside the Bennett gates, stripped of my name, my home, and my dignity, I figured I'd hit that point. My fingers trembled as I pressed the tiny clasp, expecting nothing but old gears and maybe a faded photo. But what clicked open wasn't memory, it was strategy. Hidden behind the watch's faceplate was a paper-thin USB drive, wrapped in wax paper, and a note in his familiar scrawl. "If you're holding this," they did exactly what I feared. "Give this to Richard Crane. He'll know what to do." My breath caught in my throat. Richard Crane. A name I hadn't heard since I was 17. He was grandfather's oldest friend, a semi-retired attorney who once owned half the historic buildings on East Bay Street. He vanished from our lives the year my parents pushed him out of the company. Something about conflicting visions. I'd almost forgotten about him. But of course, grandfather hadn't. He always played the long game. And suddenly I realized so would I. That same morning, I borrowed a friend's car and drove 3 hours south to Beaufort, where Richard now lived in a weathered white house that looked like it hadn't seen fresh paint since the Clinton administration. He opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd been expecting me. "Natalie," he said, and the way he said my name made my chest crack open. I handed him the watch and the note without a word. He read it, nodded once, and said, "You better come in. This is bigger than you think." Inside his study, with dust motes dancing in the sun and the air thick with old books and even older truths, Richard slid the USB into his laptop. What we saw made my skin crawl. Audio recordings of my parents discussing how to discredit me, legal drafts manipulating trust structures, shell companies in the Caymans, forged emails, even footage of Gregory Phillips coaching Meredith on what to say in court. It wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated character assassination. And for the first time since they threw me out, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt ready. Because grandfather hadn't just left me a watch. He left me a weapon. It's strange how betrayal can hollow you out until anger fills the space like fire in an old chimney. As Richard and I watched the footage loop over again, my mother calmly suggesting I be evaluated for instability, my father instructing staff to remove files from my room, Meredith laughing as she rehearsed fake testimony. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I took notes. Names. Timestamps. Voices I once trusted, turned into weapons. Richard sat across from me, his jaw tight, fingers steepled in thought. "We'll need a forensic team," he said. "Someone who can authenticate all this. Someone who's not afraid of the Bennett name." His voice was low, steady. And for the first time in weeks, I felt anchored, like I wasn't alone in this war anymore. Over the next 6 days, we built our strategy like chess players preparing for battle. Richard brought in Clara of Mendoza, a tenacious estate litigator with a reputation for dismantling dynasties with nothing more than truth and a courtroom. She reviewed the files and raised an eyebrow. "They went nuclear on you," she said. "Good thing you've got the fallout map." We hired a forensic specialist named Theo Chan, who analyzed the recordings, metadata, and forged documents, tracing back IP addresses and digital fingerprints to my sister's boyfriend, an IT contractor my parents had quietly paid under the table. But the most chilling piece? A surveillance clip from the hallway outside my grandfather's study, dated 2 weeks before his death. It showed Gregory Phillips, the family lawyer, entering with a briefcase and leaving with a thick envelope. The document inside would later appear in court as a revised will, one that conveniently cut me out completely. Except now, we had the original, stored in a cloud server grandfather had told Richard about months before his passing. He thought of everything. As we pieced the puzzle together, I stopped feeling like the quiet girl in the corner of the family photo. I became the executor of a reckoning. I sent a notice to Gregory, requesting a formal review of all Bennett estate documents under legal supervision. Richard delivered it in person. I imagined his expression when he saw the letterhead. My parents thought I'd crawl away, that I'd crumble. But now I had attorneys, evidence, and the kind of quiet fury that doesn't fade. It focuses. And I promised myself something that night, sitting beside Richard's fireplace, watching the footage one last time. They wanted war. Now they'd get one. The courtroom was colder than I expected, sterile, clinical, like a hospital waiting room designed for open-heart betrayals. I sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy suit I hadn't worn since grandfather's funeral, my palms pressed against the polished wood as if I could anchor myself to the truth just by touching it. Across from me, my parents looked composed, rehearsed. Meredith wore a pale blouse and a pearl necklace I recognized from my mother's collection, her expression somewhere between concern and condescension. Gregory Phillips gave me a tight-lipped nod, like this was all just business, as if trying to erase me from my own bloodline was nothing personal. But what none of them knew was that every time they tried to cut me out, they left a breadcrumb behind. And today, I brought the whole loaf. Clara opened with force, laying out a timeline of events so detailed it felt like peeling back flesh. The hidden audio recordings, and most damning of all, a video of my grandfather, dated 6 weeks before his death, reading aloud the contents of his will in perfect clarity. "If you're seeing this," he said to the camera, "someone is trying to undo what I chose. I chose Natalie because she earned it, not because she's my favorite, but because she's ready." I felt every word hit like a shield around my spine. Then came their side. My mother's testimony was poised, dripping with sorrow and subtle venom. She spoke of concern for my mental health, implying my emotional instability made me unfit to manage the estate. My father added that grandfather had grown confused in his final days, vulnerable to influence. Meredith, with mock tears, claimed I manipulated our grandfather by exploiting his frailty. But every accusation they flung had already been debunked. Every lie was matched with proof. Dates, signatures, audio, video. Clara dismantled them with surgical precision. When the judge recessed for deliberation, the silence in the courtroom was heavier than any outburst. I looked at my family, not one of them could meet my eyes. They hadn't just lost control. They'd underestimated me. And when the judge returned, ruling in favor of upholding the original will and ordering an investigation into potential fraud, I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply breathed, for the first time in weeks, as if justice itself had exhaled with me. I walked out of that courtroom lighter, not because the war was over, but because I'd finally dropped the burden of silence. The ruling had restored my name to everything my grandfather had intended: the estate, the business, the legacy. But the victory wasn't just in what I reclaimed. It was in what I refused to carry any longer: the need to be accepted by people who had only ever seen me as a pawn. Meredith didn't speak to me that day. She stared at the floor while our parents fumed beside her, whispering to Gregory like they were already scheming the next move. But the truth was, their power had fractured. With the court's decision came public scrutiny, headlines, legal audits, even a quiet visit from the state's Financial Crimes Division. The Bennett name, once whispered with reverence across Charleston, was now followed by a question mark. Within 2 months, I made my first decision as the controlling shareholder of Bennett Maritime Holdings. I sold the family estate, the same house that had watched me grow, suffer, and finally rise. It would no longer hold my story hostage. I took a portion of the proceeds and launched the Bennett Foundation for Ethical Business, a nonprofit aimed at mentoring women navigating hostile work environments and legacy corporations just like the one I'd inherited. The rest I invested in restructuring the company, new board members, new ethics policies, and new leadership pathways based on merit, not bloodlines. People asked if I regretted it. Walking away from the house, the name, the toxic comfort of family tradition. But I didn't walk away. I built something better. Something mine. I moved into a quiet brownstone in Savannah, where the neighbors didn't care about my last name or my trust fund, only that I watered my hydrangeas and waved at their kids. I started waking up without dread in my chest. I drank coffee slowly. I met with women from across the South, accountants, artists, lawyers, dreamers, who whispered their own stories of being pushed aside. And I told them, you don't need their permission to take up space. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found a note grandfather had left in the watches box. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build when no one thinks you can. And in that moment, I knew I was no longer trying to live up to the Bennett name. I was rewriting it. The first letter came in a crisp white envelope with no return address, tucked between an electricity bill and a charity flyer. I almost threw it out, but something made me pause. Inside was a single sheet of linen paper with 9 words scrawled in ink I recognized instantly. You did the right thing. I'm proud of you. No signature. Just that. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers tracing the handwriting as my chest tightened. It wasn't my grandfather's, he was gone, but it felt like him. Like someone had picked up the thread where he left off. For days, I couldn't stop wondering who sent it. Richard swore it wasn't him. Clara didn't believe in anonymous gestures. And Meredith, well, I hadn't heard from her since the courtroom. Until I did. 3 weeks later, a call came through from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice cracked on the recording. Natalie, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For the lies. For staying quiet when I should have stood up. You didn't deserve any of it. I sat frozen on my couch, the message playing on loop in my hands. This was the same sister who once whispered behind doors about having me committed. The same woman who watched me be dragged from my own home and did nothing. And yet there it was. A sliver of something resembling remorse. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed time to feel everything. Grief. Relief. The ache of nearly losing myself just to prove I belonged to a family that never made room for me. I started therapy. I journaled. I took long walks along the Savannah River, letting the humidity cling to my skin like a second truth. I stopped trying to be untouchable and started learning how to be real. And then one morning, as the sun filtered through my kitchen window, I felt like myself again. Not Natalie the heiress. Not Natalie the survivor. Just Natalie, woman, builder, daughter of a man who believed in her enough to plan for a war she hadn't seen coming. A woman who finally understood survival wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far more beautiful. I used to think peace would feel like silence, like the absence of pain, of noise, of people who only loved the version of me they could control. But it turns out, real peace hums. It sings softly through open windows at dawn, dances in the click of teacups against saucers, and settles in your chest like the first breath after years of holding it in. These days, my mornings begin not with urgency, but with intention. I wake up in my modest brownstone, wrap a shawl over my shoulders, and sit by the window with a pen in hand, not to sign documents or write affidavits, but to draft letters to women who've written me since the case went public. Women like Ava from Tallahassee, who was pushed out of her family business after 20 years. Or June from Asheville, whose father told her she wasn't built for leadership. I write back. Every time. Because I know now my story was never just mine. One afternoon, I hosted the first workshop under the Bennett Foundation banner. We rented out a historic space downtown, nothing flashy, just exposed brick, sunlight, and folding chairs filled with women who were done apologizing. I stood at the front, heart pounding, unsure of what to say, until I remembered the letter. You did the right thing. I'm proud of you. So I said that out loud. And the room went still, like a string had been plucked inside every chest. One woman started to cry. Another stood up and said, I haven't heard those words in 40 years. That was when I knew this was the work grandfather hoped I'd do. Not just protect what he built, but grow something from it that could outlive both of us. Later that night, I passed the old Bennett estate one last time on my drive home. The new owners had painted the shutters blue and planted dogwoods along the fence. It didn't look like a tomb anymore. It looked like a house. And I didn't feel anger or grief. I felt gratitude. That chapter had ended, and I survived it with my soul intact. I pulled into my driveway just as the sun dipped below the trees. And for the first time, I whispered something to myself I had never dared to believe. I am not what they said I was. I am what I chose to become. And that was enough.